All right. How's everyone doing? Everyone, welcome. Bruce, how you doing?
It goes. It's well, we got a few days until the inauguration. I'm expecting the ship to go down next week, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope nothing happens, but we just can't seem to tell anymore.
Apparently, the FBI received some credible reports of a specific number of people not being particularly happy and potentially doing something about it. Hopefully, nothing to be concerned about because I do not want to talk about politics for a long time. I'm done with politics.
And neither do I. It's like that whole thing's a mess. But I unfortunately don't think that stuff is going anywhere because of the personalities we have around and how closely they tie into the how closely it ties into the cultural wars and whatnot, which just has everyone hook, line, and sinker and keeps us away from more intellectual pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
Which, when it comes down to it, the intellectualism actually lays the foundation for where how a good society is actually supposed to be built from. And the more we're distracted by this cultural war bullshit, um, the less we have to actually evolve, learn, and grow, and make a better world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the annoying conversation of is it true that politics is downstream from culture? So if we want to see some substantial change among the political landscape, first you have to change the cultural attitudes, the cultural values, and then you can have an honest conversation about fiscal responsibility or economic policies. But first thing comes first when you need to change the cultural values. And I'm inclined to believe that's the case, which is why I'm so adamant in helping people like Thomas Sheedy and people like, even though I have many disagreements with Lindsay, is especially given the fact that he voted Trump, and I certainly didn't vote Trump. I still support him in his plights against postmodernism, against this crazy cultural phenomenon that we're dealing with. And what do you? I mean, we're going to talk about Nicholas Christakis and Apollo Zero, but I guess as a preliminary for that conversation, what is your stance on that argument that politics is downstream of culture?
Um, that's a good question. I could talk forever. I think I could talk forever on this, and it would probably turn into a mess. Let's leave it at this for now. We're doing a book review on Nicholas Christakis' Apollo's Arrow today. But when we say politics flows downstream from culture, well, what undergirds culture? Some very very fundamental ideas of how you think the world works. And I'd be very really interested in having this conversation with you if I know you're a voracious reader like I am, and one of the authors that I'm really starting to take a deep bite into is Mr. Thomas Sowell. I read over his book. I've been reading over his book, Discrimination and Disparities, which introduces so many new nuances to uh, causes of discrimination, and not necessarily racial discrimination, not even unhealthy discrimination.
Mhm.
But he also wrote a book several years ago called The Conflict of Visions, and he talks from there about the constrained and unconstrained visions of life. Implied in those two definitions are some fundamental ideas, I think, behind liberalism and conservatism. And when he talks about constrained and unconstrained, um, unconstrained can be thought of as being somewhat Pollyannish. Human beings are infinitely malleable, and you can eventually engineer humans socially to be acting according to the highest standards of morality for optimal results for everyone. Unconstrained is, constraint is pretty much a statement saying that humans are inherently flawed, and we have to gear our systems to get effects that are amiable to everyone, but also realize that humans are not good by nature. We work along those flaws. So politics, if we accept that, since most Americans tend to fall into the liberal or conservative camps, they eventually fall somewhere along this kind of dichotomy, even although they may not realize it to some degree. And I'll leave it at that for now because it's a complex conversation. And what I'm doing right now, I'm not really doing that conversation, that description justice. And there's some there, and I'm more than willing to bet there's so many nuances to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. I still need to catch up on my Thomas Sowell. I have about 5 of his books in my Amazon cart that I just don't have time to read. I started university again, and we're past week 2, so that means now the heavy workload is going to start coming in, and I'm
I
trying to
really,
finish.
I really think you'll like his books because I'm already really impressed by his discrimination and disparities book. I mean, like I also want to read his book on basic economics because I know shit all about econ, just like some basic concepts. But what I really want to do is take a deep dive into it,
Mhm.
so I can actually discuss the ideas that have so many of us riled up according to our moral senses. Well, that having a moral sense of fairness and whatever, it's all well and good, but unless you have as you and I both know, unless you have a fundamental idea of how things work, about the facts behind it, then how you quote unquote morally feel about some things may not actually be based in reality.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm gonna give him a go. I agree with you. I really need to catch up on my economics. I'm taking. I took macroeconomics and microeconomics in college, and I still just know jack all about economics because the problem with economics, with this discipline, is that at the very least, with a field like physics or chemistry or evolutionary biology, mathematics, it's very easy to appeal to authority in that regard. Did the Big Bang happen? Most of us don't understand the mathematics behind cosmology. They don't understand the mathematics behind the curvature of space. They wouldn't be able to do the math themselves. But we can be confident in the fact that, well, the majority of the experts in this field agree that the Big Bang occurred approximately 14 billion years ago, and they all seem to agree on the expansion rate of the universe. They all seem to agree on the shape of the universe. It's flat. So, okay, even though I don't understand it myself, I can safely just appeal to authority here. But the problem with a field like economics is that if you look at you know, how much socialization does a capitalist system require? There is no consensus among economists on that question. It seems like it's 50-50 with, whether or not they lean left or lean right. So you can't even resort to appealing to authority in that case. And it becomes so much more difficult because then it seems like, well, the default answer therefore should be for me to do my own research and come to my own conclusions, since you can't appeal to the authorities. Or at the very least, listen to the arguments proposed by the authorities and use your own personal judgment to come up to a conclusion. So that makes it so much trickier. I remember when Brexit occurred and they laid the vote for the general populace, and Richard Dawkins came out and said, people basically told him that he was a hypocrite because there were other instances in which he said the exact opposite. But regardless of that argument, Richard Dawkins came out and said, you're basically asking a completely ignorant society, and not ignorant in the sense that they're, in the general malevolent sense and sort of pretentious sense, not like that. Ignorant as in, by definition, most people would be ignorant towards economical intricacies. And so why would you ever lay down the future of a society, of a civilization, the future of like the economical future of an entire population? Why would you lay that at the hands of people who know next to nothing about economics? And I tend to agree with that argument. I think that's why representative democracies are the best. And I am very much against the idea of a direct democracy. So with economics and what and what I can do in that regard, what do I believe and what do I think is the most economically responsible, whether or not I should vote left or right, it's a lot trickier than just doing social issues. So that's why I not that I get intimidated by reading economics or looking into it. It's just that I'm much less optimistic about the idea that I would be able to come to my own conclusions. Because if I read a book about climate change, or if I read a book about anything that is even contentious in the population, like climate change is contentious, right? It shouldn't be, but it is. But what can I do? I can appeal towards climate scientists. I can appeal towards physicists because, based on what they know about thermodynamics, and I can safely say, I am confident in the conclusion that climate change is real and it is largely man-made. I cannot do that about economics, and that's why, because of that conclusion, because of that obvious answer, I'm put off from looking too deeply into economics. I don't know if I should be. I don't know if maybe that's just me being I don't know, just silly about the situation, but that's just the way I come across of it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you there because I know too little about the subject myself. But like as with anything, I don't think it's a good idea to base our beliefs so heavily on unlimited knowledge, so to speak. So at the very least, it's a good idea to get some idea of like what the terms mean, what the concepts are, and like what are some general principles that can be that are for better or worse universal to guide our thinking. I mean, like I don't know. I mean, since we're talking about economics, we can. There are a lot of names that come to mind. Like one of my favorite thinkers, Glenn Lowry. He's an economist, and Thomas Sowell is someone who I've heard referenced by so many of people I deeply respect. I know, I understand even Steven Pinker thinks Sowell is completely underrated. So Pinker has a lot of respect for Sowell's work. Now, I think he respects his work mostly as an indirect sociologist, but Sowell is known to be something of a well, he's an incredibly erudite individual. You can tell by the quality of his books; they're really well written. And I'm led to believe by these individuals that I respect that he has quite a bit of knowledge on that area. So I definitely want to delve into what he says. That being said, however, a friend of mine stated that like he doesn't necessarily agree with Sowell on everything that he writes, and he's correct. He shouldn't. But given the weight and gravity behind his work, I definitely want to read it and see what he has to say on the subject. And some of his credentials and someone with his someone who's debated as much as he has. I mean, he used to be on William F. Buckley's show, Firing Line, back in the 1980s. Had some really, really interesting things to say, and I think that his views should be given some consideration.
Yeah, I know he's very well respected, and people such as Steven Pinker speak highly of him, as do the McWhorters of the world. And I need to, really look into his work because he seems like a fascinating character that I'd like to take a deep dive in. And if I ever do take a deep dive into economics and fiscal responsibility, Sowell would be without a doubt one of the people that I look into that regard.
Yeah.
And yeah, but anyways, so today, oh wait, we got to mention. So there's a few things we got to mention.
Sure.
So we first things first, guys. How's the lighting? So I fixed a few things up. So how is the lighting on my behalf? Is it? So question that's question one, right? Question two, or not question two, but important update number two is that we officially have member stuff. What a membership program, I guess, is a good way to call it, in which you can now officially become a member of the channel. And there's 3 tiers. The first tier is what we're gonna do for the pre-recorded videos is we're gonna have credits, and people who support us on Patreon and who support us using the membership program, they will have their name in the credits if they want to. If you don't want your name in the credits, you can just go ahead and message us and we'll take it out. The second tier would you get your name in the credits as well as, and you can join us for live streams. So if you want to talk to us about something, if you want to have a debate or a conversation, whatever it may be, you are more than welcome to shoot us a message, and we can go ahead and get that ready for you. And then the last one is you get those 2 things, of course, and you also get to be a mod for the channel. So if you want to be a mod, and you could become a tier 3 member if you want to join us for a live stream, either tier 3 or tier 2, and if you want your name in the credits, tier 1. So anyways, yeah, just got to mention that because now that we passed 1,000 subscribers and we can monetize, and we can do this. There's a lot of cool stuff we can do that I've noticed, and having a YouTube channel with over 1,000 subscribers is completely different than having a YouTube channel with like 200 subscribers, because there's a whole whole bunch of stuff you can do, right? You can promote yourself, you can monetize, you can have like the super stickers and all that stuff. You can have like memberships. It's a lot of fun stuff. So we'll see what happens. I'm still new to this stuff. We're still growing. We're still little babies in the game that is called YouTube. But I just wanted to mention that before we get into the topic of today's video, even though we're already 15 minutes in and we're already completely derailed and we're not even close to talking about Nicholas Christakis or Apollo Zero. We just needed to mention this, all right? So anyways, so today we're talking about Apollo Zero. We were supposed to talk about this about like 2 weeks ago, but we just never did. By Nicholas Christakis, and it's basically about a particular pandemic that is going on right now. It talks about the history of other pandemics, the history of epidemiology to some extent, the information and the most up-to-date studies that we have on the pandemic, and how it's going to affect us in the future, whether or not there's going to be any significant social ramifications down the line due to the pandemic itself. So first things first, Mr. Bruce, what do you think about the book?
I really enjoyed it. Now, a small disclaimer. I read it about, say, a month or two ago. I had the advantage of winning an early copy of it. Like you and I are both on Goodreads, and Goodreads is a social media website that promotes reading. You can show your friends like what exactly you've read, what you thought of certain books, review certain things written by certain authors, and they occasionally have these giveaway programs, so in which you can click on one of these contests and sometimes score free books well ahead of the time it was released. And that's actually how I got my first copy of Enlightenment Now. So I was able to read Apollo Zero before anyone else got a copy of it. Right. The book I thought was it was great. It's pretty much a breakdown of the coronavirus, what it is, what were the first known cases of it in China, theoretically, what the best information that we had at the time, how did it become transmissible from animal species to human beings. It goes into a description of some of the terms we've heard in the media about what contact tracing is, what's the scientific jargon mean behind the terms like R0 and whatnot, and how likely it is that we'll get a vaccine, how they work. It also doubles as a history book, like how did plagues become prevalent in throughout the evolution of humans as we moved from being hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists to the large eggheads we are today. Mm-hmm. That evolution didn't come without costs. It made it easy for diseases to spread and for pandemics to become possible. So, overall, from both a sociological and medical perspective for the layman, I thought it was an excellent book. Very much enjoyed the read, and I definitely suggest everyone read it if they want to get a good breakdown of the significance of COVID-19 and what do they mean when they're talking about this in the media?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. It's an absolutely stellar book. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads because it is, one, I think it should be a foundational text for understanding the current pandemic. Nicholas Christakis is without a doubt a reputational source, and he backs up everything that he says with substantial studies and information and footnotes, so you can sort of double check your information. But very quickly, already we have a member. So everyone welcome Ghost Bunny, who is officially our very first member. So here's the thing. Not only was Ghost Bunny the first member, she was also our first mod. So everyone give Bunny a round of applause. Welcome Ghost Bunny. First of all, thank you so much. Thank you endlessly. Thank you anyone who decides to subscribe or become a member or send a super chat, whatever it may be. Thank you endlessly. It really legitimately does mean a lot to us. The fact that anyone even cares about what it is that we're saying is a big deal. But thank you so much, Ghost Bunny. It means a lot. We have officially our first member. And she became a Babylon fanatic. Yeah, so it goes a Babylon simp, tier 1, Babylon fanatic, tier 2, and then tier 3 is the Babylon yandere. Do you know what a yandere is, Bruce?
I have no idea. But hey, Ghost Bunny, I see she's the first with a hoodie. I got to see that.
Yeah, she also bought a hoodie. Yeah, I retweeted her. She bought a hoodie. We got some amazing fans out here. Amazing fans, amazing people, and friends, of course. If you're a fan, you're a friend. Don't think of yourself as a fan. Think of yourself as a friend. You're part of the family. No Babylon, bro, David. Yeah, no. So
Not yet.
there's supposed to be like what are they like what's a good term for like someone who's obsessed with like either like a guy is obsessed with like a girl or a girl's obsessed with a guy like to an unhealthy degree. Not like a stalker, but yeah, not like a stalker.
Babylon stalker.
Yeah, so I tried to do it in that one, right? So like the first one is Babylon simp, and then like a fanatic, and then a yandere, which a yandere is like a Japanese word for someone who is hardcore obsessed with someone. So like the idea behind being so obsessed with this guy that you're willing to murder his entire family, so that way the only person that he can spend time with is you. So crazy, you know, that's the way that I tried to structure our membership program under a really unhealthy relationship with us, because I thought it was hilarious. So thank you so much, Ghost Bunny. Really means a lot. Yeah, of course you're a friend, Ghost Bunny. It's not even a question. You're a friend, of course. But anyways, yeah, so the book is fantastic, and yeah, as you said, it presents the information for how to interpret the pandemic, not just from a sociological perspective, but also from a pharmaceutical and medical perspective. So it gives you the equations when it comes to the infection rate, and as you said, contact tracing. What is a good way to determine how many people were in contact with patient zero in this case? And it does a great job at that. And one of the things that it does that it really does that it does amazingly well is compare the current pandemic towards previous pandemics, whether we're talking about the 2009 influenza pandemic or the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. And what's interesting is that this is the only time, as far as I'm concerned, this was my interpretation of the information that was presented to me, is that as far as I'm concerned, this seems to be the very first time, the very first pandemic in which we are waiting for a vaccine to save us from everything. Because there are two ways, there are two responses towards a pandemic. One is the pharmaceutical response, which would be stuff like vaccines, stuff like something that I got that how am I forgetting this? Like flu tests to determine whether or not you have it, right? Why did I forget like the word for that? But so that's the first aspect. One, responding to it pharmaceutically. The second one is responding to it culturally or sociologically, making sure that we have good social distancing mechanisms to make sure that we decrease the likelihood of spreading it. Stuff like staying at home, lockdown orders. That would be the second the second way that we respond to it. And what's interesting is that if you analyze the previous pandemics, 2009, 1918, previous so far, what's interesting is that generally speaking, the sociological responses towards a pandemic tend to be pretty effective, and a vaccine doesn't come out until the tail end of when the cases are becoming less and less reported, right? So you have this giant hump where first you notice that the pandemic is occurring. And by the way, I want to make it perfectly clear, we are not experts. We are doing our best to relay the information that we got from Nicholas Christakis from this book, Apollo's Arrow. So this is not research that I am conducting myself. This is research that has been conducted from other people that as far as I'm concerned, is the consensus among epidemiologists. So it's not like I'm just finding one crackpot theory, one guy who has a PhD in this field and is coming up with crackpot theories. This is coming from, as far as I'm concerned, generally accepted information. And so what was interesting was that usually what happens is that a vaccine comes at the tail end of the drop in newly reported cases. So you have cases being reported, it increases exponentially, and then it slowly starts to drop down. And it's not until the tail end, when basically we already kind of we didn't get rid of the pandemic, but it's towards the end where the vaccine then comes into place and just makes sure that new cases don't spike. This is the first time, as far as I'm concerned, that cases are still rising, and we're still waiting for the vaccine, and we're about to get the vaccine. So did you interpret that in the same way that I did, where this seems to be the first the first instance of a pandemic that is recorded in which we are hoping for a vaccine to save our ass, because the sociological response to the pandemic, we haven't been doing a good job at it, or this is simply a case where we have a moderately infectious disease that is that is moderately dangerous, moderately lethal, and so it seems to be the perfect combination for something that is long lasting. Did you interpret it in the same way I did?
No, that's okay. So again, it was about a month or so ago that I read this book. So there's some of it I don't remember, but like I'm coming off reading another book that reads in a very, very similar fashion to Apollo's Arrow, and like this book that I think is also excellent. It's called Very, Very, Very Dreadful. The influenza pandemic of 1918, and that book was written before we even heard of anything about COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the 1918 pandemic was no joke. It was much more lethal than COVID-19. But we've had a few other pandemics since then, and I'm not sure what the vaccine rollout was for those other. If there was a vaccine rollout for any of those others, so I don't really have a comparison.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think I will go ahead and say that this is definitely a marvel of how scientific development has really moved along. Because, I mean, if we were to use the plague of 1918 as an example, 1918 was the Spanish flu back then was just something that was so devastating to people, not just in terms of taking human life, but it was also a ball buster, it threw a cloud over the morale of our medical community, because we were coming off back then a variety of scientific discoveries. We had Joseph Lister coming up with the idea of like people should be sanitized whenever they do surgeries, use carbolic acid to remove like any kind of microscopic organisms that could be in your surgical tools. We discovered what bacteria was, and we knew that bacteria could cause sicknesses and whatnot. So they're coming off a high of all these medical advancements, and all of a sudden, the 1918 Spanish flu comes along, which is caused by viruses, and they didn't even know what viruses are back then. All they knew was that they had this invisible killer moving around, and this because of how technology had come into the world, and how much easier it was to connect humans to one another. It was the first global pandemic. It spread around the globe.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, they had no idea how to treat it. They couldn't even detect it. So there was no way to create a vaccine for it. It wasn't until maybe 20 years later that they invented the electron microscope and that could actually see what it was. And I'm led to believe that to this day there is no vaccine for even the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
So now compare that to what we have in the modern era, in which we discovered COVID-19 just over a year ago, and now we're at the stage where we have a vaccine. And so now I don't know if this is an example of where we're getting a vaccine at the quote unquote tail end of the plague, but having it within a year of it becoming a pandemic, that's pretty good. Mm-hmm. And that's something to really marvel at.
Yeah, we're getting it hella fast, and it certainly isn't the case that we're getting it at the tail end, because cases are still rising. But the idea that we managed to receive this substantially less, like what is it, about a little over a year at this point, where it's probably going to be able to become widely distributed among the general population, that's fantastic. And I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know if this is just because we skipped through a lot of bureaucracy, or if it's because maybe we were a bit sloppy in our medical pursuits. But from what I'm seeing, that the percentage of the efficacy percentage for this is pretty good. But I don't. Did you like look into whether or not the reasoning behind why it was so fast was because we cut through a lot of bureaucracy crap, or because maybe we were sloppy in our research capacity? Like, do you know which one it was?
Are you talking about the efficacy of the vaccine, or how fast we were able to roll it out?
No. Like how we managed to get it finished so quickly, because usually this takes like 2 years, but we managed to do it within a year. So do you know if the reasoning behind how we managed to get it done so quickly was because we like cut through a lot of like annoying sort of like business level stuff, or maybe because we just didn't do all the required testing that would have originally been required? I don't know the answer to this.
I honestly don't know the answer to that either. I mean, but this is a good time to circle back into the book, because I'm making a lot of comparisons to the 1918 Spanish flu. So, I mean, back then, people didn't know what a virus was. Like I said, there was a time when large segments of the population locked themselves indoors, and they would go so far as to try to like plug up their keyholes to make sure not even one breath of air got into a living residence to be sure that they weren't infected. And there were some instances of quote unquote social distancing that were utilized back then, but I'm led to believe that in a lot of cases they were optional. And a lot of people, especially in the military, ended up dying in the result, especially when the second wave hit. Fast forward almost 100 years later, and you'd think that the lessons we learned from such a devastating time in history would have carried over into the 2020 pandemic. Now, previously, I was talking earlier about how through the miracle of modern science, we were able to churn out a vaccine in the space of a year. But, in as much as that gives me a sense of optimism, I'm also somewhat despondent about this, because it tells me that we failed to learn from history. We didn't implement some of these social protocols as early as we should have. And science has given us the ability to immediately sequence the genome of the disease. And I think if we had truly learned our lessons and been able to apply the wisdom of the past to the circumstances of the past year, then those lessons, according to the technology and what we've been able to develop, should have been able to handle this pandemic so much more effectively. So we're looking at a juxtaposition of the miracle of modern science and the complete failure of us to prevent something like the 1918 from happening again. Now, I can't say that COVID-19 is as lethal as 1918. No, but it was bad enough to say that, oh shit, did we learn anything at all for being quote unquote enlightened people? And it's kind of depressing. And I have to say, largely I don't think we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were completely ill-equipped to deal with this, which is embarrassing, because this wasn't even the pandemic that we were expecting to occur. Beforehand, the pandemic that most epidemiologists were predicting that would have occurred was one caused by the Nipah virus, which has a death rate up to 70%. And if we couldn't even deal with one that, as far as I'm concerned, has a death rate between 0.5 and 2%, we're not quite sure which one specifically it was. We heard the number of 6% earlier on, but obviously that's not taking into consideration people that got it, but they, because they thought it was a normal flu, they stayed home, unreported cases. But we're looking at between 0.5 and 2% death rate, as far as I'm concerned. The fact that we were completely ill-equipped to deal with that, especially here in the United States, where one, the testing kits were flawed at first, and then the CDC took its sweet time to even collaborate. So we did embarrassingly poor dealing with this. And one of the fascinating things that I noticed was that China, we're going to get into the China question. We kind of have to, because this is a structural conversation that I think is important. Where, well, first, before we get into that, we got another member. So first of all, P became a member as well. He's a fanatic. He's also a Patreon supporter. So he supports us on Patreon, and now they support us on YouTube. So endless thanks. Thank you so much, P. Means the world. Thank you so much. This is exciting. Having membership, it's so exciting, isn't it? And David Solomon, who looks an awful lot like Matt Dillahunty, is saying that scientists got the vaccine by studying the Quran. I agree. That's what I was getting to. But yeah, so what was amazing about China was that they implemented some of the most seemingly not even seemingly, they implemented some of the most draconian measurements in order to make sure that the pandemic couldn't spread. They, you basically had to request to leave your house, and you could only leave your house a maximum number of twice a week, and that was only for essentials. They would have toothpicks on elevator doors to make so that way that you could press the buttons with the toothpicks. They implemented some of the craziest things I ever witnessed ever occur. And what I and on this can be described as an authoritarian regime at this point. The implementations that they did. And so if that's the question, so here's my question. Obviously, they managed to drop their cases to 0 new cases in April, I think, if my information is correct. But what ended up occurring, shortly after that, the pandemic came back. But ignoring the fact that it came back, whatever. Let's say, for the sake of the argument, that what China did was effective, and we're looking at a totalitarian regime that from a utilitarian perspective is completely effective in the way that you minimize the damage done to a population from a pandemic. If that is the case, if what we're looking at is that the most effective mode of government is an authoritarian one, a totalitarian one, and this will decrease the likelihood that people die from pandemics, that will get sick, and you have future future ramifications for this, because we still don't know what happens even if someone gets the certain virus. What happens if they get it, they heal up, but are there any future issues that are going to occur? We don't know the answer to that. Would you say, from a utilitarian perspective, if it is effective, maybe an authoritative and totalitarian response is the most ethical way to respond towards a pandemic, if it is the most effective, which from what we've seen with China, it seems to be the case? Could you come up with an argument against becoming China in this situation?
So this is something I need to think very carefully about, but what's my argument against this? Okay, so let's go this route. Earlier during this podcast, I was talking about the idea of not the idea, but two dichotomous responses about unconstrained natures and constrained natures, as Thomas Sowell put it. You can go ahead and make the argument that China's draconian response to locking people down and going and taking extreme measures to do so was indeed effective in dealing with the pandemic. But that implies that you're giving that you're putting a lot of power into certain government institutions and people who can make arbitrary decisions on someone's behalf. In some cases, perhaps having that kind of authority is effective. There's no lollygagging around. And one of the weaknesses of a liberal democracy is the idea that people have to hash things out, to debate subject matter in order to come to a decision. And we see that now today when people are saying like, oh, we want our freedom, okay, but there's this disease going on, and some people will want to go one way or the other, when the reality is that, like, going in the pursuit of absolute of freedom in this case, and I'm speaking generalities here, can result in death, right? So if we're following that kind of paradigm, then wait, hang on, give me 1 second.
Yeah, no worries. All right. Anyways, Sabala Toda 2, welcome to the stream. It's all right, no worries. And Fatima, tell Kat they're already choppy before you clicked on this stream. Tell her that I was already complaining, so she can shove it up her ass. I'm kidding. Don't say that last part. I love you, Kat. I love you, Kat.
I'm back.
Hey, welcome back.
Okay, so liberal democracies, as I was saying, they tend to need to argue things out and eventually come to a decision. But sometimes you have to act decisively. I think in the short term, having that kind of power could result in some short term gain. But when you invest, when you have that much authority at your disposal, and if you follow the, shall we say, the constrained notion of human nature, the humanity is inherently flawed, then what happens when they have that kind of power? They might make a decision now that is quote unquote correct, but when things get a little bit more complicated and you have a cult of personality develop, then that paradigm no longer applies. It's no longer utilitarian. I know a little bit about China's Great Leap Forward, and I think there was an instance in where I think Chairman Mao was spreading some crazy ideas about how to develop crops, or some kind of some ways to develop metal. I don't know. I only have a vague idea of the history here. But he's putting these crackpot ideas because of the cult of personality and the authoritarian nature of the government helped bring that about. Mm-hmm. There was no debate, there was no rationality, and debate is how you get to a rational decision. Mm-hmm. So without that in the end what was devastating. So I don't have a specific easy answer to this one. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it can be utilitarian, and other times it's not. That's probably the best answer I can give you at that point. I'm not clear on where exactly that is, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard, but the reason why it's hard is that, and the reason why I think utilitarianism it isn't so clear-cut and dry as saying, well, what increases the well-being of society is the route that you go, is that there's going to be situations and there's going to be many externalities that you have to take into consideration when calculating the well-being of society. So it's not as easy as saying that, like, well, generally speaking, an open liberal democracy is the best method of government for increasing the well-being of society. But when we're talking about pandemics, or maybe when we're talking about wartime, maybe, yeah, then you switch the mode of government into a totalitarian or an authoritative one. Maybe that's the correct equation to analyze this from. But then you also have to take into consideration, well, what about the trust that the general population would have towards their governments if they recognize that this is something that they can do? If they are under the impression that the government is more than welcome to become totalitarian once a pandemic occurs, how do you know that the general trust in our institutions, in the government, from the general population isn't going to decrease to the point where you can say it would have been better off if we just kept it as a liberal democracy to begin with? And this is why utilitarianism is really hard. You can't. It's not easy to calculate it. And so that's why I don't know what the answer to that is, because we know for a fact there's so much civil unrest, specifically in Hong Kong, because of, obviously the protests in Hong Kong first started as a response to an extradition act, but then it morphed into something in which they were protesting the government in general. But we know that the level of respect for the government over there is nowhere near the same way as you would hope for, or as how they would want you to believe. So you have to take that into consideration. You have to take other externalities that I'm sure exist out there that someone way smarter than I can probably come up with. But that's why I'm not so I am not so quick to respond to, because I'm a utilitarian, but even if that's the case, I'm not quick to respond to an absolute yes, become like China once we're talking about a pandemic. I'm not quick to do that.
Okay, so you and I both did a podcast once with Jay Shapiro. Do you remember that one?
I remember that was a great podcast.
Okay,
Yes.
so what we talked about Carl Schmitt in that podcast, right? And okay, so Carl Schmitt was someone who thought liberal democracy was a joke. And why did he say that? During that era, like there were a lot of doubts about the success of liberal democracies, right? So his whole argument was that he considered liberal democracy to be a farce, because in as much as people need a debate, in as much that people need to come together and talk to hash things out, he thought this is all theatrical. Inevitably, when a disaster struck, or if something disastrous happened, then whoever got, say, the final say in that kind of tumultuous in an environment that was just tumultuous, whoever had the ability to call, say, emergency powers ultimately pulled everyone's strings. It didn't matter what was debated. It didn't matter what occurred at that time. So in his that was his way of justifying the failures of a liberal system. Now, agree with him or disagree with him, and I don't agree with him. There is something there to be said about the execution of power.
Yeah, and it really is hard. I mean, I don't agree with Carl Schmitt, obviously. I think liberal democracies, I think the evidence for liberal democracies being effective for increasing the well-being of society is overwhelming. Even, and usually the arguments against liberal democracies are more philosophical in the same way that, Marxist philosophies are. But we're not getting too deep into that one. But how do we respond to it? Like, I just don't know, because what if the default just, man, I don't want to open up a huge can of worms with like this question, but what are the default to something where you don't know? So like in the China question, I simply don't know. I don't know what the externalities could be. If that's the case, if the default response is don't know, just keep the status quo, because you already know what's going to happen if you keep the status quo, and as dangerous as it is than if you were to just do anything new. Man, these questions are hard. They legitimately are. That's why I get angry when you see people who are like so strident and almost as if they like know the obvious answer, specifically with economic questions, to bring it back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast or video, whatever this is. But yeah. And anyways, so moving on from the question, one of the things that I also found fascinating about the book was the way that the people generally responded to it. So one of them is you noticed a surprising increase in what do we call it? Gratitude, in reciprocity, in not reciprocity, actually, in selfless behavior. So you saw the percentage of people who were polled and asked, how often does your neighbor check up on you, or how often does your family check up on you? How often did you yourself help other people out of the kindness of your heart? Stuff like questions like that significantly rose after the pandemic and as a direct response to it. So what I found interesting is that we could look at this as a philosophical analysis on human nature, where many people are quick to assume that we are inherently evil, the sort of Joker Dark Knight interpretation of society, where when the chips are down, these people will eat each other and people will become savages, basically. Doesn't seem to be the case. Maybe it is the case if something way worse happened, but when we're talking about a pandemic like the one that we're seeing now, it seems like human nature has a pretty good reputation at this point, where people were becoming increasingly selfless. People were helping out their neighbors at rates that were much higher. And what was interesting is that because we are a social species, what we also saw was an increase in anxiety. We saw an increase in depression. I don't know if we saw an increase in suicides. I didn't look at the data for that, but my assumption would be that, yeah, there probably is. If you see an increase in anxiety and depression and any negative ailment that a person would have, you'll probably see an increase in suicide. But it was interesting as a, looking at the situation academically, people generally speaking, in this sort of yellow alert situation, not like a Mad Max world, but in this situation specifically, human nature seems to be on a pretty good standing, and we are way more social probably than than we originally expected. Where I don't believe so many people that I've asked, how has your life changed, right? And so many of them, I don't know, as a joke or because they like keeping this reputation about themselves, they'll say, my life is exactly the same because I never leave. I'm such an introvert. Ha ha ha. I'm always inside. So many of these people talk like it's to the point where I don't even believe you at this point. I think you're just pulling up a facade. But it seems like we are way more social as a species than originally believed. So from an analysis of looking into how people react, how we are, what have you noticed differently in society?
My view on this is actually really, really depressing because, yeah, I mean, to take a step back from this, again, I think it's a failure going from history and from sociology. There's a great book out there called, I think it's called Tribe or whatnot, and I forgot what the author who the
Is this
author
the
is.
Amy Chua book?
I'm sorry.
Is this the Amy Chua book?
No, it's not. It's not immature. It was the book itself. The message behind it, I thought, was generally pretty positive. And he brought to example several instances of people who have been, for better or worse, trapped in incredibly undesirable circumstances. And some of the examples that he pulled up were communities that had to survive bombing runs in World War II. And I think he also referenced how certain communities were boxed in. I think it was in Bosnia in the 1990s or something like that. Anyway, the book is replete with examples of such of these kinds of circumstances. And in those events, people were much more likely to reach out to each other, to help each other out, to feed, to clothe, to comfort and whatnot. And people felt tied together more. Suicide rates go down, and that real communal, that real positive aspect of humanity really, really shines through. And yeah, I guess you can say that happened during this past year in the pandemic. But where I'm extremely pessimistic is that although that did happen, it did not happen to nearly the degree that I thought it would, because we're split down the middle in terms of COVID denialists and COVID realists. And if I'm so bold as to say this next part, also what I would call the COVID fanatics, who in my opinion probably crossed the threshold from having a decent respect for the virus and preserving the lives of other people to those who just feared to the extent that they wanted to implement the most extreme safety measures as possible. But I'm getting off track. The bottom line is that because of this splitting of two movies narrative, I don't think that communal aspect truly came through in this past year. And another reason why is in the book, it's made clear that although this is a pandemic, the lethality of the virus is more in, and I'm definitely not saying it's not lethal. It obviously is, but it's not as directly as to go to the extremes. It's not something that is as lethal as, say, something like Ebola its lethality is much less than that, but its
Mhm.
true danger is its ability to spread. And we have no defense against it. Some people, a lot of people will survive it. A lot of people will not.
Right.
And because it's not as strikingly lethal, then that's part of the reason why we have something of an attitude where people don't take it as seriously as they perhaps should.
Mhm.
So yes, there is an improved communal aspect to how we treat others, how we help people out. Small businesses, giving them a little extra money, trying to be there for people online, trying to form these communities. Yes, all good, but not quite because of the ambiguity involved.
Allow me to politely disagree with you
Yes.
and propose a potential counter argument. I
Sure.
think what you're saying would be true if we're looking at a 50-50 disparity between the people who do recognize the dangers of the pandemic and versus the people who think it is overamplified. From the statistics that was provided by Christakis, I think it was like, we're looking at 75% of the people who agree that the pandemic is dangerous and we need to do something about it. And that the other 25% isn't like people who say it doesn't exist and, a pandemic. No, they're either people who say they're just not really that concerned about it, or they don't think that the death rate is high enough to be concerned about it. We're talking about like a tiny percentage of people who legitimately think that this is something akin of a pandemic. We're talking about a tiny percentage of people who are actually believing that if you drink bleach, you will cure it. But the problem is that these people, because of either the power of social media or because they have high people in high places, like the president of the United States, people are under the impression that like it's like the woke left. Like, yeah, the wokeness is crazy and there's way too many people who believe in wokeness, right? But the fact of the matter is that if you poll people on the left, if you poll Democrats, what is the percentage of them who actually agree with wokeness? It's not as high as you think. It's less than half of them. But the reasoning behind why it seems like wokeness is everywhere is because these people are so loud. It's the same thing with the COVID denialists. They're few and they're far in between, but they're so loud. They're making such a ruckus to the point where now it seems like everyone believes this, right? Candace Owens is not when Candace Owens gets like 80,000 likes on a tweet where she's calling this
She makes
one of
me
the
sick.
biggest hoax. Yeah, she's disgusting. She's awful. Her book sucks. Don't read Blackout. But if you're under the impression that those 80,000 likes that Candace Owens got on a tweet that is calling this the biggest hoax in America's history, or like a Dennis Prager tweet, who like Dennis Prager tweeted out basically saying this is like the biggest, like the one of the biggest catastrophes that ever happened in this country. Like the fact like this, the fact that they actually convinced us that this is a big deal. If you think that those two tweets are actually representative of the right or of the general conservative movement, I think you're out of your mind. I think these are just two loud losers who are under the impression that they actually have the correct information. I think they're just conspiracy theorists at this point. But most people, well, first of all, most people have no idea who Candace Owens is. Most conservatives have no idea who any of these people are. Most people are not on Twitter. Most people are not on YouTube. Most people are not getting their information from Charlie Kirk's Saturday morning show, or like it's not even whatever, his morning show. Most people aren't doing that. Most conservatives are just boring blue collar workers. Most conservatives and most liberals, they're not really in tune to it. As far as they're concerned, their philosophy behind economics, their philosophy behind social politics is really just based on their own personal moral intuitions and epistemologies. They're not reading Thomas Sowell. They're not watching David Pakman every morning. They're not doing any of that stuff. And so that's why that's why people are so surprised when these polls come out and they see like over 75% of people agree that the pandemic is something serious that we need to be concerned about. That's why so we have to be careful when we say things like, oh, so many people think that this thing isn't actually a real thing. There's so much divide. Partisanship is at an all-time high, which it is. Partisanship is at an all-time high in this country, but that does not mean that therefore human nature is at an all-time low. I think that the studies that, not the studies, but the polls that were conducted, and the percentage of people who say that selflessness increased, that they recognize that the pandemic is something that is legitimately dangerous. I think we can safely conclude that from a human nature perspective, when we're not talking about a Mad Max world, it seems like we're pretty good on selflessness. And it makes sense given that we evolved to be selfless. It would be kind of weird if, given what we know about evolutionary biology, about our evolutionary origins, it would be kind of weird if all it took was a pandemic that has a death rate less than 2% to get us to go just like completely batshit crazy and to just be completely hardcore tribalistic. I'd be surprised if that was the conclusion.
Yeah, you could be right, but okay. Now I'm speaking from complete anecdotal experience here. I happen to have lived in two communities that apparently have almost two polar opposite political views. Not quite, but it's there. So in one of the communities I live in, it's ultra liberal. Okay, and I shouldn't even say that. Like, okay, wokeness has nothing to do with liberalism, nothing at all. It's very, very leftist. It's very, very woke.
Mm-hmm.
And the degree in which it's spread has very, very much disturbed me. The jargon is there. The attitude is there. Are people generally ignorant of it? Possibly. And I'm willing to grant that they can be talked out of it if they knew a little bit more about the egregiousness behind it. But nonetheless, it is there, and so are the apologetics for it.
Mm-hmm.
In the other environment, it's Trumpian. Okay, you hear these bullshit excuses for President Trump, how he's playing three-dimensional chess, how I've had people come up to me and tell me that COVID is a hoax. I've had people come up to say that there's never been a pandemic, and some who actually believe that being injected with a vaccine will, I don't know, like inject Borg nanoprobes into your bloodstream.
Nice.
Now, again, these are anecdotal, but these are everyday people you run into. However, to be fair, there's also been a variety of people who believe on the spectrum. There are people who I would say lean woke, but even they, when presented with certain criteria, not criteria, with certain when presented with nuance, will say like, whoa, yeah, you're right, that is a little too far, and we can have a decent conversation there. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, there are conservatives who say, hey, this COVID stuff is no joke, but we still think this lockdown stuff goes a little bit too far. Okay, that there's something to be said about that. So it's like there's a spectrum. So yeah, you might be right that human nature has presented itself in a much more optimistic fashion than I'm giving it right now. But speaking from my own personal experiences, and this is totally my own bias speaking, right now I have a very pessimistic nature of it. But to be fair, you could very, very well be right, and yeah, that is a good counter argument, I will say.
We got 3 super chats, so this is exciting. So we got 2 from Render unto Caesar, who is one of our biggest fans, always gives us so much love. He says, "Hey now," and he gave us $4.99. Hey, how you doing? And he said, "But to wokeness have positions of power," which they do, which makes it all the more infuriating that people like Vash and David Pakman don't think it's that big of a deal, even when it's in the government, even when it's in the academy, in the upper echelons of these two fields. they still don't think it's a problem. That's hilarious. Um, and then P is saying that the book was Hindu phobic by failing to mention Vedic sciences advance Ayurveda battles any pandemic. It's proven that Gomutra works since I gotta read up on Hinduism. Typical leftist and urban Naxa. Yeah. Do you agree with that? That seems I agree. It was very Hindu phobic.
It was very Hindu phobic. They mentioned that its science is eventually doubt. What the fuck?
It's obviously it's a meme. And then Dave Solomon is saying, yes, wokeness has nothing to do with liberalism. Problem is they hold too much cultural and institutional power. Academia and Hollywood, for example. They have all of Hollywood. They have all of academia, which I hope that the Hollywood one is changing. Because recently, did you see that Matthew McConaughey was on Jordan Peterson's podcast? Kurt Russell recently spoke out about actors basically like forcing their viewpoints down everybody's throat. Ricky Gervais, obviously, at the Golden Globes, and
Kurt
recently,
Russell?
Yeah, Kurt Russell.
Oh, wait, I
And
didn't.
yeah, I'll send you the article.
I know about Matthew McConaughey because it was probably a really really good thing that he got on Jordan Peterson's podcast because he's been out of action for a very very long time. I like to believe that his reach. Peterson was someone who appealed to both conservatives and liberals alike, and his arm is very very long. So having the influence of Jordan Peterson, along with the kind of star power that Matthew McConaughey has, that can really touch a lot of minds out there. And I know that people are down on Jordan for some of his religious viewpoints. I am too, but in general, I like the guy, and I think he definitely has value in some of what he says, and not the least of which is the kind of power he can bring to fighting against wokeism and putting liberalism back on the proper track.
Yeah. And I hope the culture is changing. Well, I don't know what her name is, but she's in The Mandalorian. She's like I think is that her? Is that her name?
Yep.
Say it again.
Gina Carano.
I think that's her. Yeah, she recently spoke out against this about how people seem to just sort of hide their personal viewpoints because they're scared of the backlash that they're going to get from Hollywood because it's just such a huge echo chamber. So I hope it's changing, and I'm noticing more and more academics speaking out about this. I often mention the op-ed by a physicist in the Wall Street Journal. So I hope the culture is changing for the better. I hope. I don't know. It's difficult to gauge it because for every Matthew McConaughey, there's like 10 Brie Larsons. So who knows? I hope it's the case.
Yeah, this is just a really really depressing subject. Mm-hmm. It's something I unfortunately I think about very very often because I think we need more and more voices against it. I mean, who knows where this all goes? I mean, if we want to get back to the book, then the pandemic, COVID-19. Let me put it this way: the world's going to change, and there may be some sociological changes in how we do things once we leave, once we're able to walk freely among people again. I mean, like I don't think this habit will change. Like, will people still shake hands? Will people still hug? Probably, but will we have new ways to physically greet each other, like that, like let's say introducing the Japanese bow or something like that? I don't think it'll go that far, but there's definitely some changes that'll come around. Technology has really really taken off. We may see more meetings in Zoom. We may find ways to communicate with each other from people across the world in different time zones, which is also definitely taken off recently. And now, I never want a pandemic to happen, but if you're going to have a pandemic, it may as well be now. And one of the reasons I say that is because if we backtrack 100 years, and we're back in the time of 1918, there was no internet. We didn't have this technology for us to interact with each other. We didn't have these news networks that allow us to interconnect. Mm-hmm. Now, in 2020, we had the ability to at least meet to some degree, to interact with each other. I will definitely not say that we got it right this time. And humans have a tendency to forget things that aren't in recent memory.
Yeah.
But hopefully, with with our ability to preserve um, events events in history in digital format and keep them in posterity, there will be we will be more poised to deal with the next one. I mean, right now we're dealing with a pandemic, right? And Bill Gates has warned about this for a very, very long time. Um, it'll happen again, maybe not for a while, but it will happen again. And this probably should be a wake-up call that we have other problems that we haven't even begun to face. I think there's an issue of running out of antibiotics. That's another scary thing that could happen. Um, and just all these other issues that we quite frankly have been warned about, but have not paid any attention to. That's going to come back and bite us in the ass.
Yeah.
So the world's going to change, and hopefully for the better, and especially hopefully that we start taking a look at these things that, oh, that'll never happen again. Oh, we can worry about that later. Bullshit. Take care of it now when you have a chance to actually take care of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there are some things that we really need to take into consideration. Matt McCarthy talks about this in Superbugs, where he says that the effectiveness of antibiotics is expected to be almost at a 0% by like 2050. I think that's what he said. I think that's like the specific statistic that he gave. But antibiotics are becoming less and less effective because of superbugs. They're able to counteract the strongest antibiotics that we have. So that's a huge concern that we have. How do we? And part of the reasoning behind that is because the pharmaceutical industry just doesn't incentivize well making antibiotics, because the revenue that you get from that is just so tremendously low. So there's a lot of things that we need to think about that we're completely ill-equipped to deal with. And as you said, one of the most obvious ones is this pandemic, and it's going to happen again. And the fact that this wasn't even the one that we were expecting. We were expecting a way more dangerous one. The fact that we botched basically an easy test is embarrassing. It really is embarrassing. We were completely unprepared for this. And I can only hope that in the future, when the Nipah virus actually comes in with its death rate up to 70%, that we're much better, in a much better place. But from 0 to 5 stars, what would you give Apollo Zero, since this is a review after all?
I would give it a 5. I would give it a 5.
Oh,
Yeah. I like the way it was written. I thought it was very, very detailed. I thought it was very easy to read. It broke down concepts that you can read about in the news, but you may not necessarily be familiar with. I really enjoyed it. I'll go ahead and plug this other book I read. For those of you who like Apollo's Arrow, definitely read Very Dreadful: The Influenza Pandemic of 1918 by Albert Marin. That's an excellent supplement to this book. Excellent read.
Yeah, I gotta read that one myself. But yeah, I agree with you on Apollo Zero. I think it's exceptionally well written. It's incredibly detailed. It's backed up, as far as I'm concerned, by a lot of data, and it's an easy read as well. So it's a pretty long book. I think over 300 pages, 320, 330, somewhere around there. Yeah. But you'll get through it done quick. I finished it in just a few days. It's a fantastic book. 5 out of 5. I gave it on Goodreads, and without a doubt, one of the most important and pertinent books that you can read right now.
Oh yeah,
yeah. So, and I think we can end the stream there, because I think you said we only had like about an hour. You only had about an hour, and then we went well beyond that by 15 minutes. So, anything else that you want to add, Bruce? Anything important? Anything important that you recently did?
Anything important that I recently did? Oh, right. I created my own. Well, you created it for me and you shared it with me. You helped me put together my my Twitter account.
Yep.
and I'll be getting more active on that and interacting with all our listeners on there.
So
Awesome.
everyone go follow Bruce on Twitter. He will follow back, do not worry, at Bruce Babylon. So, at Bruce Babylon, you should find him. It's the same logo as here. Unfortunately, he has not doxed his face yet, so you don't get to see what he looks like. Rest assured, he doesn't look like a goblin, or he's not gross looking or anything like that. But everyone, go give him a follow. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to this live stream. We will be live again tomorrow. I'm not sure to talk about what, maybe just shoot the shit. I'm currently quarantined inside my room. I haven't left this place in forever because I tested positive, I'm afraid. And but I should be good by next week. Oh, maybe. I don't know if I should say this. I won't say this, but we'll see if you guys know what I'm talking about tomorrow. So there's going to be a surprise tomorrow. There will be a surprise on tomorrow's live stream. So be on the lookout for that. But anyways, everyone, thank you so much for the super chats. Thank you so much for becoming members. We got 2 members today. Let's see how many members we can get tomorrow. We need to have a member threshold where if we hit 10 members, then maybe Bruce will show his face. I don't know. I'd have to talk with him behind the scenes because he's very secretive. He's a very secretive boy. But we'll see what happens. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for stopping by, and make sure you like, comment, subscribe, do your thing, and we'll see you guys later.
Good night, fellas.